Well, good evening, and thank you very much for coming this evening to the launch of the Renewable Energy Superpower report. And it's great to see so many of you here tonight. My name is Stephen Bygrave, and I'm the CEO of Beyond Zero Emissions. And this is now our 10th report that we've launched in the Zero Carbon Australia series. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered, the Wurundjeri people, and pay our respects to elders both past, present and future. So we're here tonight to launch a report which has been some 2 years in the making. It's actually a very interesting report to launch because it actually is built off a lot of the research we've done on stationary energy, energy efficiency, energy efficient buildings, transport system that runs off electricity based on renewable energy. And this report's also very timely because we have a major climate conference coming up in a little over a month's time, in about 6 weeks. The world is converging in Paris to hopefully negotiate a comprehensive global agreement on climate change. And this report highlights, amongst many things, that Australia will actually benefit from a decarbonised global economy and should be pushing for more ambitious targets, greenhouse gas emission targets at Paris, rather than dragging its feet as it has been doing for many years, and most recently over the last couple of years. But more on that later when we receive a detailed presentation on the report. So this is the 10th of our BZE reports, Zero Carbon Australia reports, and we've done reports on stationary energy. We've done a stationary energy plan, a buildings plan, a high-speed rail report, a LAGAR to leader report, a land use paper. We've launched a book, The Energy Freedom Home, how every home can be a net generator of energy, not a net energy consumer. And in the lead up to this report, Australia as a renewable energy superpower, we've also done 2 other reports called Fossil Economy and Carbon Crisis. And work underway includes our electric vehicles report and also a Zero Carbon Australia book, which tries to bring all of the disparate reports together into one publication. BZE is also now working with local communities and local governments to actually adapt our plans to be relevant at a local community and local government level. And we're working with Byron Shire Council to actually implement the plans on the ground. We've got working groups on energy, transport, land use, waste, buildings, and we're working with community working groups to actually implement the plans on the ground. So Byron Bay is committed to be Australia's first zero emissions community in 10 years' time. Very, very exciting. We're also Thank you. We're also working internationally with a number of international climate change NGOs to push for a zero emissions goal in the Paris text. There are many leaders who have said we need net zero emissions, we need zero emissions in the second half of the century. What we're trying to do is push for that text to be included specifically in the Paris Agreement. So why is BZE doing this work? Well, the world has agreed that a safe level of warming by the end of this century is 2 degrees. Now, for many people in this room, 2 degrees is 2 degrees too high. But 2 degrees means zero emissions in the second half of the century. And less than 2 degrees means going beyond zero emissions in as rapid time frame as possible. So our organisation is working with leading universities in Australia, including Melbourne University. We've collaborated with the Melbourne Energy Institute and the Melbourne Sustainable Societies Institute. We're also collaborating with the University of New South Wales, ANU, and University of Newcastle, amongst others. And we're laying out the technical pathway on how this transition to zero emissions can occur across every sector of the economy. Now, interestingly, our current Prime Minister, not the recently dismissed Prime Minister, our current Prime Minister has previously acknowledged the work of Beyond Zero Emissions, saying, and I quote, "It provides the most comprehensive technical blueprint yet for for what our engineers, our scientists can begin to do tomorrow. He also acknowledged, and I quote, that simple arithmetic says that all of our energy must be sourced from zero emissions technology by mid-century. So we'll be trying to talk to the Prime Minister about how he can remain true to those words. So how can you help support our work? We are entirely funded by donations from philanthropic grants and sales of our reports. So if you'd like to support our work, please donate. Go to our website, purchase one of our publications outside today, or speak to one of our volunteers in the blue t-shirts with the circles with Beyond Zero Emissions on them. And they will help you after the event tonight. So a very brief layout of the structure for tonight's program. We'll have a keynote presentation in about 2 minutes' time. We'll also have a presentation of the Renewable Energy Superpower report by the report's author, Gerard. We'll then have a panel discussion, and I'll introduce the panelists later. We have a very distinguished lineup of panelists tonight. We're very grateful for that. And then we'll have some questions and answers. So we'll allow questions and answers from the audience. And in doing so, we'll ask you to line up behind a mic in the corridors so we don't have to run around passing mics through the audience. So we'll save a lot of time. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker tonight. And many of you will know Fergus Green. Fergus Green is a researcher and policy consultant based at the London School of Economics and Political Science. From January 2014 to October 2015, he was a policy analyst and research advisor to Professor Nicholas Stern at the LSE's Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment and the Centre for Climate Change Economics and Policy, where his work focused on international climate cooperation, China, and various theoretical topics relating to climate change mitigation. He's actually an alumnus from Melbourne University, in fact an author of one of BZE's earlier reports, Lagarde's Leader, and he moved to London after receiving a 2012 John Myers Scholarship. He's currently undertaking a PhD in the LSE Department of Government, where his research focuses on the politics and efforts to distribute losses and gains in major economic policy reforms. Quite a tongue twister. So please everyone welcome Fergus Green.
Okay, we've got there technically. Well, thanks very much, Steve, for that very kind welcome. It's wonderful to see so many people here to celebrate the launch of this fantastic new report. It's a great pleasure for me, particularly to be back at the University of Melbourne and to be supporting the work of BZE. They're two organisations that are very close to my heart. Let me first congratulate Gerard and the wider team at BZE on producing this important and really high quality report. It's a report, I think, whose time has come. And what I want to do in my brief remarks today is sort of situate the report in the global economic and political context relating to climate change. And in particular, I want to highlight just three big things that I think have changed relating to climate change, economics and politics over the last 3, 4, 5 years. Particularly in the period since I've been based in London. I left about 3 years ago. And those three things are the structure of international climate cooperation, the economics of domestic climate action and our understanding of the economics, and China's economy. So I want to just touch very briefly, given that we're about to, in 5 weeks' time or so, kick off the International Climate Conference in Paris, as Stephen mentioned. Just touch briefly on how I think the structure of international climate cooperation has changed and why that's relevant to this report in particular. So for 20 years, from the early 1990s, the international community was aiming for what you might call a broad and deep form of international climate cooperation. Sort of this treaties, targets and trading model, this idea we have a comprehensive treaty where every country gets allocated an emissions reduction target and in one go we agree targets that will add up to this 2-degree goal. And then we have this kind of strong, binding, enforcement-oriented mechanism that force countries to meet their targets, and we have this kind of complex international trading system that might help countries reduce targets at lowest cost. I think it's now clear that that model has failed year after year, or the international community has failed to kind of agree on that kind of broad and deep model. But what's really changed over the last few years after the failure of the Copenhagen conference in particular is that we've sort of dramatically lowered our expectations for international climate cooperation. And what we're now aiming for is a kind of broad but shallow model of cooperation. The idea is that countries will determine for themselves what they will do to reduce emissions, that there'll be a kind of minimalist sort of framework for tracking progress in countries' emissions reductions, and then we have a framework by which countries will come back every sort of 5 years and agree to strengthen and have more and more ambitious targets, which I think is actually quite a realistic expectation, and I'll be sort of touching on the reasons why in a minute. But the really important takeaway that's relevant for this report, I think, is that under this kind of broad but shallow approach to climate change mitigation, to emissions reduction, countries need to find their own path to decarbonisation. So we can't wait for some comprehensive international treaty to tell us what to do, or we are just going to plug into this global emissions trading scheme that we hope will eventuate. Countries need to find their own pathway to decarbonising. Which takes us to the second point, to my second point about what's changed, the economics of domestic action. And here I think we have reason to be much more ambitious and more hopeful. So traditionally there was a kind of consensus understanding, or assumption at least, that all climate action, or most climate action, was just costly. It was just a cost, right? It was about shifting from one mode of production or consumption to another mode that was less carbon intensive but more costly. And it led to a sort of internationally this language of burden sharing, and domestically it leads countries to sort of two responses, or governments to kind of two responses. One is to avoid mitigation as much as possible, and secondly, insofar as you do mitigation, just to do it as cheaply as possible. And if that means, paying Indonesia to avoid chopping down forests, and you can do that for $5 a tonne, then that was sort of logically the best way of reducing our emissions. But I think our understanding of the economics of domestic climate change mitigation has changed radically over the last, even just 2 or 3 years. To the point where I can now confidently say, but more relevantly, people like Lord Stern can confidently say that we have good reason to think that with well-designed policies in place at the national level, that the national economic benefits of action will likely outweigh the national cost of action, at least over the medium term, sort of 5 to 10 years, and certainly beyond that, even if we just completely put aside the benefits from avoided climate change. So that's a really, I think, important inversion of the economics of domestic action, that the benefits are likely to outweigh the costs for individual countries. And so I just want to touch briefly on some of the mechanisms that kind of go into reaching that conclusion. So the first is this is not a new, this is sort of the only point that's sort of not so new, but there's plenty of sources of kind of negative cost emissions reduction. So here you've got your sort of ACME, McKinsey cost abatement curve, and anything that's sort of negative cost like energy efficiency, or at a macro level, removing fossil fuel subsidies, obviously saves money as well as saving emissions. But we've known that for a long time, so I want to talk a little bit about some of the more interesting work that's been done on the economics over the last few years. So this is kind of a cost at a snapshot in time. But some of the really interesting work is about how the cost and relative prices change over time. Because if we're considering the transition to a zero carbon economy, we need to consider how costs and benefits of mitigation action change over time. We know that in particular renewable energy technologies, like many other technologies, have already exhibited strongly falling costs over time, and we understand the mechanisms by which this occurs. It's a result of innovation, right? So sort of upstream innovation kind of creates the technologies, learning by research, but the cost reductions really occur in the deployment phase, and we know that we've got the technologies we need, and when we deploy them, the more we deploy them, the more we kind of learn by doing and reduce costs over time. That way, we get economies of scale that also help reduce costs. and so on. So this has led to the kind of dramatic reductions, in solar PV. For example, this graph's a bit old, but this plots the reduction in price with deployment. And of course we've witnessed this in Australia. But one other kind of dynamic of cost reduction that's been less relevant in the past that I think is going to be more relevant in the future is kind of systemic change. So the existing fossil fuel-based energy system benefits from existing infrastructure, existing networks and institutional arrangements that favour centralised electricity generation and oil-based transport. But as we increasingly tip towards a system based on energy efficiency, renewable energy, electrification and the management of intermittency through energy storage and through demand management, that system is going to have its own kind of systemic advantages in terms of institutions and infrastructure. So that's another reason why we can expect the cost of clean energy technologies to fall over time. We've also seen a lot of interesting work on the wider benefits of climate change action, economic benefits, that is. There's been a lot of interesting work done on the public health benefits of moving away from coal and from oil-based transport, interesting work on the energy security benefits and also micro-level productivity benefits from a range of more efficient buildings and efficient transport systems and so on. But I want to just quickly highlight some of the sort of macro benefits which a lot of my colleagues at the Grantham Institute have been working on over the last few years, the kind of dynamic national level macroeconomic benefits from well-managed transition to a low-carbon economy. And in particular, I think one of the benefits which we will continue to see and see increasingly in Australia, if we do this well, is sort of macro benefits from clean innovation. We need to see this as a really important potential source of future economic growth. Because it's clear that the clean technology sector is one of the most knowledge-intensive and innovative sectors in the economy, and it produces new valuable knowledge that spills over into other sectors, driving economic growth throughout the economy. And some of my colleagues have done some really interesting work looking at patent data and patent citation data. I'm just going to show you quickly this chart. This is on the left 1,000 patents for dirty technologies in the electricity generation and transport sector, and on the right 1,000 patents and the citations to them from clean technologies in those sectors. And it kind of nicely illustrates the kind of fecundity of the clean technologies, with much more kind of knowledge spillovers and other people creating new inventions based on the clean technology inventions. The idea is that if we kind of invest in more in clean technologies, we're likely to have much greater kind of knowledge spillovers and innovation-driven economic growth. And there are lots of other kind of potential macroeconomic advantages that I could touch on, but I want to just now finally turn to my last kind of third big change that I think has happened over the last few years, which is about China. So from the period of roughly 2000 to 2013, China's economic strategy or model kind of relied broadly on kind of heavy amount of state-directed investment in property construction, in the heavy industries to produce construction materials like steel, cement, aluminium and glass, which use a lot of energy, and investment in coal-fired power stations to provide the extraordinary amounts of energy that those industries need. That was, a big part of China's economic model from 2000 to 2013, and of course Australia provided a lot of the raw materials in terms of coal and iron ore to support that model. But it's now patently clear, it's clear to the Chinese people, it's clear to the central government in China that model is economically, financially, socially and environmentally unsustainable, and China is now rapidly moving away from that model towards a model based on kind of better quality growth is what they're aspiring to, which involves a lower growth rate, so less economic activity, greater domestic consumption, moving away from exports, and shifting their investment away from these heavy energy-intensive industries towards more innovative manufacturing and service industries, which of course use a lot less energy. And they're also going on a big energy efficiency drive and are investing in non-coal energy sources. So all of those things mean that China's emissions are likely to be lower, but also that their economic structure and what they're going to be trading and importing is going to change significantly in the years ahead. And I just want to show you, to sort of finish by showing a couple of the sort of what that might mean for Australia. So China's coal consumption, which grew at 9 or 10% a year over 2013, was flat or slightly falling in 2014 and has fallen even more strongly in 2015 and is likely to continue to fall. And this has been a key driver of much lower global coal prices. So this is the Australian coal price over the last 5 years, and you can see it's fallen by about 60% relative to its peak in January 2011. And of course, as China is shedding its coal consumption, the first things to go are the imports. Right, so Chinese coal imports fell 11% last year, and they're down 30% year on year in 2015. And as its steel production declines, it's also using less iron ore. And so this chart shows Australia, the kind of combined value of Australia's exports of iron ore and coal over the last decade. And you can see the kind of decline in the recent few years. So that's just kind of the way China's economy is going in one direction. And then on the other side, China is investing massively in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and low pollution technologies. And I just want to highlight kind of what China's doing already and some of its targets. And it provides a nice comparison. So that tiny little dot that you can hardly even see, that's Australia's current wind energy capacity at 3 gigawatts. The smaller circle that you can see is China's current wind energy capacity at 100 gigawatts. Their 2020 target, the upper end of their target, is for 300 gigawatts. And this 1.1 terawatts of wind power, this is not an official target, but earlier this year a bunch of energy planning agencies in China did this kind of thought exercise scenario called a high penetration renewable scenario. And this is sort of the kind of thing that's being seriously discussed in China. So this is kind of what they're looking at for wind power. So obviously it's sort of partly an unfair comparison because their electricity sector is 25 times the size of Australia's. But it's a great indication of where the world's kind of soon to be biggest economy is going. And the sort of question for us is, do we want a piece of that action, I guess? And a similar thing on solar, so Australia's current solar versus kind of the sorts of things China's talking about over the next 15 years. So I think that nicely kind of frames where our largest trading partner is going. So to conclude, we're at a time where international climate cooperation is relatively minimal, and countries need to construct their own domestic pathways to decarbonisation. But we're at a time where it's now clear that the domestic economic benefits of action are likely to outweigh the cost of action if we design our policies well. And at a time where our largest trading partner is fast shedding its reliance on coal and embarking on the largest green growth strategy the world has ever seen. And it's also at a time domestically in Australia where interest rates are low, so it's a good time to be doing capital investment, higher unemployment and low growth. So really, there's never been a better time for Australia to lay the economic foundations to become a renewable energy superpower. And with that, I'll pass on to Gerard. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks, Ferg, and it really does set the scene for the next presentation. And the question, do we want a piece of that action? I think we do, and we'll hear more about that now. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Gerard Drew. I'm sure for those of you who will buy a copy of the report, read it online, that you'll be very, very impressed with the work that Gerard's done. It's an outstanding piece of work. Just a bit of introduction to Gerard. Prior to joining Beyond Zero Emissions in 2011, Gerard had a background in pursuing an engineering degree, an engineering career in automotive design and development in Australia and Asia. He's got a degree in aerospace engineering, so that was very well suited. But he saw the error of his ways and joined Beyond Zero Emissions. And he started work as a volunteer and in fact contributed and led projects looking at decarbonisation of Australia's transport, energy and international trade sectors. He authored the Fossil Economy Report and the Carbon Crisis Report, which are the lead or the precursors to this Renewable Energy Superpower Report. And he also co-authored the Zero Carbon Australia High-Speed Rail Report. So, Gerard, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks for the introduction. Renewable Energy Superpower, as I said, it's a catchy title. Kind of conjures up images of the Cold War, I think. Superpowers vying for domination, the gatekeepers of the world's energy. Throw in renewables and maybe the image distorts a little to vast wind and solar farms feeding energy to lesser nations. To the superpowers the spoils, and to lesser nations a large energy bill and constant anxiety. This is a little dramatised, of course, but this is kind of how it's worked in the fossil energy era. But the fossil energy era is coming to an end. We know that fossil energy is not compatible with a safe climate. We must decarbonise. The world's already started the process of transition from this fossil energy era to the renewable energy era. Those big bubbles that Ferg showed you. That's all right. That's too bad. But before, when you saw the big bubbles at Ferg, those gigantic balloons of wind and solar, and we can see where things are going. But this superpower narrative is where we began researching this report. There's easily enough renewable energy weathering the Australian continent to power the entire world. Can't we simply just replace fossil energy exports with exports of renewable energy commodities? This was kind of our original hypothesis where we started from. But I'm really pleased to be here to share the things that we've learned tonight about how this is changing. And what I'm not going to do actually is take you through blow by blow of the report. There's a lot in it, and I hope you take the time to read through it. I've also learned that not everyone shares my love of charts, so I'm not going to saturate the room. But I have got a couple because I can't help myself. There'll also be a little bit of fun fact trivia for the audience, so you've got to keep your wits about it. The main thing that I really want to get across tonight is I want to relate how renewable energy is changing the energy world. I also want to show the opportunities it presents for a place like Australia and what we can and really need to do to capitalise on these opportunities. The thing is that renewable energy is a different beast altogether. It's not simply replacing a faulty polluting part with a new clean one. This is a redesign of a machine. And nothing illustrates this better than the disruptive introduction of rooftop solar. Here's a typical humble Melbourne home. Until recently, what I'm calling the fossil energy era, the time till now, the arrangement for powering our homes has been unchanged, importing power from the grid. Electricity is produced at large power stations like Hazelwood here, and they're mostly fossil energy. This is transmitted across power lines and a regular bill from your retailer without fail every single quarter. There's simply been no other option. With the introduction of rooftop solar, this has changed. Rooftop solar has not only given households the opportunity to reduce their carbon footprint, but also reduce their energy bills. And it also enables independence from these energy providers. This has particularly appealed to Australians as a result of recent price hikes in grid electricity. After enjoying some of the lowest cost electricity for many years, as we can see here, this is a chart of the power prices from 85 till 2005. You can see our power prices were pretty steady, possibly even declining. But the powers that be thought that they could improve the situation, and our state utilities were merged into a national scheme made up of private companies and state-owned businesses. This is called the National Electricity Market, and it was initiated in 1998 by the Howard government, and it took until 2005 to be fully completed. And at that time it was declared a major success. I quote. And they like to hit those words down. So from 2005, clearly prices shot up, catching customers by surprise and really destroying the trust between the trust in energy companies, making consumers wary of any further price pressures from energy providers and other types of reforms like carbon pricing. As we can see, the effects of carbon pricing are pretty negligible. What I'm going to do is walk through the different elements of what solar has done and this new framework of renewable energy and the system around it, which is changing this relationship of energy from users and the traditional providers. And I'm going to explain this first from the household, and then I'm going to show you how this relates to the world scale. Now, rooftop solar has become affordable at a rapid pace, particularly in the sunny states of Australia like Queensland, WA and South Australia. Australia is one of the cheapest places in the world for solar PV, second only to Germany. And this, of course, is on a per panel installed basis. But Australia is a lot sunnier than Germany, and every panel installed in Australia generates a lot more electricity for the owner than someone in Germany. So this means that the electricity from rooftop PV in Australia is the lowest in the world. And as a result, Australia now has the highest percentage of solar rooftops of any nation. Even our roofs are sun smart. Add to that batteries. These have only really begun to be considered as a real opportunity, an affordable kind of option. But these batteries will allow solar owners to use more of their own low-cost electricity and less from the grid. They make it possible for households to become fully independent from the major electricity supply, if they want to. Once a household has made their investment in solar and maybe a battery, it really makes sense to maximise the value of this investment. By shifting their appliances to electric, they can move off, they can use more of their own low-cost power. They can at least stop paying gas bills by moving all their contractions to electric, even if they choose to stay connected to the electricity grid. Now, power companies have been slow to come to terms with this change, but they now recognise its inevitable march, and they're trying to catch in. Because the demand for large-scale power is going down, the value of the grid is being reduced. And customers with rooftop solar are less profitable for retailers than customers without. Customers of gas companies can disappear completely. Like Richard Keach, the author of our Energy Freedom Home book, who took his house off gas completely and wrote books so others could learn how to do it also. We'll buy one on the way out. I call him the home liberator. Essentially, there's declining demand for what energy companies have to offer. Looking further ahead, we can see the introduction of electric cars, adding another load to domestic power. And this is an interesting issue that I want to dig into a little bit. So let's say you're an enthusiastic home energy person, and you've taken your home off the grid completely. You have to install a fairly big solar power set up on your roof, say 5 kilowatts, and a couple of batteries so you can weather through those winter weeks, maybe 20 kilowatt hours. And electrified all of your appliances, so you're disconnected from the electricity grid and the gas grid. Now this might be a bit costly, say $20,000 to $30,000 for this sort of arrangement, but you might think that that's a pretty good value for you and your peace of mind. But what happens when the time comes that you buy an electric car? The last link in decarbonising your personal affairs. Now, some people might drive a little, and some people might drive a lot. Now, I'm going to reach here for the extreme scenario. Let's say you drive a lot. You bought a Tesla, lucky you, and you regularly come home with low charge in your 60 kilowatt hour vehicle battery. Now, this sort of driving is very energy intensive. And so what do you do in this situation? To remain independent, you might need to increase your solar and battery capacity by 5 times or more. The system that first cost you $25,000 to $30,000 might cost you more than $100,000 now to remain fully independent. You could do this, but do you still think it's good value? Alternatively, you could keep this home system as it is, meeting your essential needs, and charge your Tesla at the local supercharger station down the road. This is connected to a large-scale generator, renewable of course, and each recharge is pretty cheap. What's easy for the supercharger is difficult and expensive for the individual. Now, some might choose option A and hang the expense, but I believe most people would take option B and charge at the superpower station. So, let me take some time and recap the turn of events that we've gone through here. Clearly, the historic arrangements are changing dramatically. Renewable energy enables independence and autonomy. Renewable energy is cheaper where resources are better. In fact, across the typical range of solar and wind, prices can halve from a good location to an ordinary location. Renewable energy is electric. So obviously demand for importing energy from the grid is going down as these things are installed on people's homes. But accommodating energy intensive activity is not for everyone. This is a bit of an example of rationing of energy and the economic decision making that will come in the renewable energy era. This will all seem pretty obvious to most people, this kind of changing dynamic at the household level. But what's familiar to this story at home, the penny hasn't quite dropped, but this is the exact same story at the world scale. And I want to demonstrate that, how this translates to the international level. Let's replace our Melbourne home with Japan. This is a busy night in Tokyo. And we'll replace Hazelwood with one of Australia's big coal mines, which supplies a lot of Japan's power at the moment. We'll replace that network with how a lot of this energy is transported around the world today by ship, sometimes by pipeline, but a lot of it's by ship. And of course, Japan still has their energy bill coming in every quarter, and they've got a big one. And that brings us to fun fact, trivia number 1 for the evening. So I'm going to ask the audience to shout out answers. I'll pick one. Here's the question. Of all the tons of cargo shipped around the world today, how much of it do you think is fossil fuels?
40%. 50.
Right, we're a stat here. We've got a 1, we've got a 40, and we've got an 80. 90. And a 90. Okay. Very close, the gentleman on the right. 43% of all of the items shipped around the world is coal, crude, petroleum, or gas. Now, obviously, this is going to change. Who's got shares in shipping companies? Okay, back to our scenario. In the fossil energy era, this was the only option for nations without resources. To import it from nations with a surplus. Saudi Arabia, heaps of oil. Russia, loads of gas. And Australia, buckets of coal. Independence wasn't an option, no matter what the cost. Just like rooftop solar has changed things for households and their power companies, renewable energy is going to change things for importing nations like Japan and major exporters like Australia. These same factors for households hold true for the world's energy. Better resources equal cheaper power from country to country. The application of renewable energy allows countries to be independent. And the electrification is one way to make more use of this renewable power that these countries have, decarbonising their activity on the way. Equally, energy-intensive industry is not for everyone. While a country like Japan, forgive me, I'm going to pick on Japan for the evening, while Japan may look to be self-sufficient for its essential activities, domestic power for households and businesses, what have you, transportation, essential industries, health, all these sorts of food distribution, all these kind of things, of course, are strategic things that you definitely want to take care of. And then once you've done that independently, you have some peace of mind. But just like our household with a Tesla, Japan will have to decide whether it's good value to support its own energy-intensive industry. Perhaps they'll see it as better value to let someone else take care of energy-intensive industry and focus their efforts elsewhere. Somewhere with plenty of sun, plenty of land, low cost, abundant energy. Anyone know a place like that? Yeah, of course, coal mines will be crowded out. These are the forces that will reshape the world's energy use in the renewable energy era. As I said, it's a new beast. This changing nature of energy presents a number of opportunities, particularly for a place like Australia, with its land and its sun, and don't forget its wind. Now, I've narrowed these opportunities down into three major opportunities. And I'll go through these one by one. Opportunity number one, the build out. Now, according to the IEA, $53 trillion over the next 20 years will be invested in energy across the world, all types of energy. And we can think of this investment outlook as some sort of a crystal ball into the future. This is people's intentions and expectations of the future. Let's have a look at the breakdown of that and see where things are headed. Now, if you look at renewable energy, the power system that's connected to biofuels as well, and all the energy efficiency investments that take place over the next 20 years, that's 55% of that $53 trillion that we spend across the world. Now that is a major opportunity. That's where those big bubbles come from FERG. A lot of this is concentrated in the Asian region. Alternatively, coal, if you're shackled to it, is only going to be 1% of that picture. I know which horse I'd be backing. An important thing to understand about this build-out of renewable energy is this is a limited time opportunity. It's not like coal where you develop a mine and maybe there's a bit of a sugar hit of activity when the mine's developed, and then that settles down into a nice kind of, turning the crank, regular income from selling all that coal over, the rest of its life. It's not the case with renewable energy. You only get the sugar hit. That's the only thing there is. Because maybe there's a tiny little bit of maintenance, but that's very negligible, and there's no fuel cost. It's all built in up front with your investment. So if you miss the train, goodbye $53 trillion, or 50% of it anyway. So in order to be part of the action, as you would say, you really have to be prepared for this this rapid build out across the world. Johnny come lately is not going to be making too much business here. It's going to be the people with the reputation, the best performance, the known reliability, existing supply chains and customer relationships. They're going to be the ones that are ready to capitalise on this opportunity. So we really have to get our act together to be prepared to capitalise on this opportunity. Now, as I said, renewable energy resources, they are spread right across the world, and every country can be independent if it chooses to be. But these resources aren't distributed evenly. Now, what you're looking at there is the combined potential generating of wind and solar together, per square metre. And what you can see is that Australia is one of the brightest, orangest countries in the world. Now, having the energy is not enough on its own. Of course, you need the land for one to harvest all this energy that's beaming down on us or blowing across us. But also you need the skills to know how to convert that into something useful and the industry capacity to make it a reality. That's why I've blanked out a few of the countries here that aren't fortunate enough to have those added necessities that really could make them superpower. What you can see is Australia is a bit of a standout as a superpower across the world. We've got it all. We've got the best renewable resources, we've got the capacity, we've got the skills, we've got heaps of land. And our resources, our renewable resources, are like far, far in excess of our fossil energy resources. Now, because of that capacity in Australia, that makes Australia a candidate for opportunity number 2, which is the migration of energy-intensive industries. As I said, it will cost a lot for countries like Japan with poorer resources to maintain their energy-intensive industries. Either they can publicly subsidise these industries to keep them, but that will cost the public purse quite a lot, or they can pass those costs on, higher energy costs to those industries. But those industries can relocate to somewhere where energy is cheaper, and they'll have to do that to remain competitive. So either way, if you're a country with lower quality resources, it's going to be more costly to maintain these industries. The natural home for these industries, countries with exceptional renewable resources, these renewable energy superpowers, and Australia is top of the list of the candidates. And as you can see, this is not, this shift to renewable energy is not a return to agrarian ways of living. This is big business. Here's a handful of those industries, those energy intensive and the trade exposed industries, the ones that are really mobile around the world. And the annual trade of these handful, five industries is $2.3 trillion. That's far in excess of everything that we make in Australia at the moment. And then there's the third opportunity, and this is a bit more familiar to that superpower Cold War narrative that we started with, the production of renewable energy commodities. Now, well, I do believe that there's going to be a significant role for these, the trade in these commodities. It's going to be a shadow of its former fossil fuel self. So we're talking about biofuel here, hydrogen, and perhaps even some direct exchange of electricity. Now, because there's still some challenging applications, there's aviation, there's shipping, for example. These are pretty tough things to accommodate. Biofuels is an obvious candidate. But these commodities are not the same as fossil fuel commodities. It's not just the person that has them in the ground that digs them up. These are produced and they're energy intensive. These commodities, the production of these commodities is really just more energy intensive industries, and the same rules apply as opportunity number 2. These places will gravitate towards renewable energy superpowers, abundant, low-cost energy. Biofuel, hydrogen, electricity here. The way they're producing a biofuel, yeah, it's a lot of photosynthesis going on, but to convert that into a useful product, there's a lot of agitation of these gigantic vats of fluid and the processing of that into a usable fuel. Energy intensive. Hydrogen from water for electrolysis is extremely electricity intensive. And electricity, you have to generate that. That's a given. So as I said, all of these industries will gravitate towards renewable energy superpowers. Now there's a bit of an idea on what the market value of these industries might be. We consider biofuel for one. If you just consider the fuel that's used in shipping and aviation, well, that's worth about $180 billion a year now. That's pretty big business on its own. Hydrogen, even if you discounted the whole potential of this hydrogen society, hydrogen as a main energy medium, and just focus, we just really drill down to one tiny application of hydrogen, which is the production of ammonia, which is used in fertiliser now. Hydrogen is a base product of that now, and that market is $20 billion a year internationally. So these are all pretty big numbers, pretty substantial industries in their own right. So here we are. These are our three major opportunities for renewable energy superpowers, and Australia is the top candidate to be one of these. The future is electric for Australia. This is an exciting future for us to be a key contributor, supplying innovative renewable energy solutions to the transition and being a powerhouse of global industry. But Australia's promotion to a renewable energy superpower status, it's not a foregone conclusion. Having the best resource is one thing, but turning that into a competitive advantage is another entirely. So the recent price rise that we looked at right at the start of this talk, that price rise that customers see really defies the fact that Australia actually has some of the lowest wholesale electricity in the world. So there's some big divergence in between wholesale power and the resources that power that and what customers see, something in the middle. What's happening there? Now, many people have caught up with the issues of network gold plating, but perhaps not all of you. I'll just touch the surface of this. There's a lot of cause and effect at play, but essentially what's happened is network companies have spent a lot of money increasing the capacity of the transmission and distribution lines since the national electricity market was introduced in 2005. So this is fun fact trivia number 2 from the audience. How much did the network spend on the grid since 2005? Please shout some numbers.
45 billion.
45, 55, 70
billion.
Okay.
85 billion reports a year behind.
Alright, well the number I got is around about 75 billion. Good work. Incidentally, that's almost enough to build high-speed rail from Melbourne to Brisbane. Check out the report on the way out. Okay. Now, because network cost recovery is guaranteed by our new national regulator, customers must pay for this expenditure in their power bills. Now, at the same time that the networks are spending $75 billion building up the capacity of the grid, demand has peaked and declined. Demand is actually lower now than it was in 2005. Maybe we should spend money on a fast train. The point is that the cost of each kilowatt hour of electricity consumed is now higher. This is not the only cause, but this is by far the main cause of power price increases. This divergence between networks expanding and consumers contracting. And the effect of this also falls mainly on households because they bear most of the cost of networks. Industries use a lot more volume of electricity, so they're a bit closer to the actual wholesale price rather than the households. Now, if Australia's going to have competitive power prices again, the only way to do that is to put this excess capacity to good use. Now, let's go back to something we covered earlier. Renewable energy is electric. Electricity is the most versatile of all energy mediums. Electricity is the easiest and most affordable form of renewable energy. Every home and business is already connected to the electricity system. And now we've got a whole bunch of extra capacity to make use of. A positive move will be to start shifting our use of gas and petroleum to electricity. And the best place to start this actually is in your own home, where even at today's elevated electricity prices, it's cheaper to do your heating and driving with electricity than with gas or petroleum. If you have solar power, better still. Now, if you were to compare these energy mediums just on a joule for joule basis, as we've got on the screen, now electricity really looks like the most costly option. You must be crazy to suggest such a thing. But this is now possible because of the superior energy efficiency of electric devices. Even though electricity is more expensive on a per joule basis, electricity devices can do a hell of a lot more with that joule than your gas or petroleum devices. The cost for useful energy output is lower for electricity than both gas and petroleum, and this is obviously the most important thing, what it does for you. Now I'll give you an example to make my point. Simple, humble hot water system sitting outside, neglected, forgotten about. Now, let's say this is a 200 litre tank of water. It'll take about 70 megajoules, give or take, to bring it to the boil. Just a scenario. Now, your gas hot water system is about 85% efficient. Every megajoule of gas that you pump into it, 85% of it actually goes to heating the water. The electric alternative here, this is a heat pump, is over 100% efficient, 250% for this particular device, but they can go even higher, above 400%. And they can do this because they don't only use the electricity that is connected to them through the power cord, but they also harvest all of this energy that's just sitting around outside of it in the ambient air, converting that into useful energy. And the use of that energy means that it can convert much more than the electricity that you pay for into useful heat in your hot water service. So the electricity, the gas that you need to buy is 82 megajoules, and the electricity you need to buy is only 28 megajoules. So we've got these differences in cost per megajoule for gas and electricity, but the cost to boil your tank of water is $2.40 for gas and $2 for electric. So at the end of the day, you want your water boiled, electric is the cheaper option to go for. 20% in this scenario, but you can get much more efficient appliances for this and reduce those numbers even further. Now, making this comparison across all typical uses for gas and petroleum puts the cost of energy in a new perspective. And this perspective is the value to users. So this difference is in efficiency between gas and electric and petroleum and electric vehicles is applied here to convert the raw price of gas and petroleum into the electric appliance equivalent. So where electric was more expensive before, you can see that it's more expensive to use gas for your heating, your house, your water, your cooking, than if you had plugged in electric. Same if you were driving a car with petroleum, electric motors are much more efficient than a combustion engine. So from this perspective, you can see that electricity offers better value to users. It's not only possible to switch from fossil fuels to renewable electricity. It's economic. This is economic fuel switching. Now, consolidating energy use to the electricity system is one move Australia can make ahead of the rest of the world. No one else has done this yet. You're the first. First to know. By doing this, we can prepare Australia for a low-emission future. We can reduce the cost of the excess grid capacity that we've built by bringing power prices back down. By using that capacity, we can turn a gigantic error into our own advantage, preparing Australia for the future. At the same time, we can stop spending money on the gas network, almost $500 billion a year, and reduce Australia's petroleum imports. Fun fact trivia number 3. How much did Australia spend on petroleum imports last year?
20 billion.
20, 20, 25, you know. Okay, the answer is $40.8 billion. This is Australia's single biggest liability. Now, as I said, these actions are things you can start in your own homes. Save you money, at the same time will accelerate Australia's move to renewable electricity, renewable energy generally. To really make the most of our electricity system, it's not just about making the most of the electricity grid that the networks have gone and run away and made a debacle of, but also it's making the most of the new technologies available, the new beast that's evolving. Now, to do this, the national electricity market needs to be reformed. Rooftop solar, batteries, electric vehicles, smart meters, smart appliances, energy management systems, all of these things play their part in lowering your electricity costs and better use of the infrastructure that's there. Unfortunately, the national electricity market as it's structured at the moment won't reward you for these investments with their true value. Individuals and energy companies will continue to protect their own interests in this sort of combative response to, I'm going to threaten to take my house off the grid, and electricity companies will return the favour by saying, well, I'm going to charge you if you take your house off the grid, I'm going to increase the fixed costs, all these sorts of things, this sort of unhelpful, uncoordinated activity. What we need is an integrated approach that aligns everyone's interests. The individuals that are investing in their own energy solutions, and the energy companies that are investing in the broader energy system around us as well. These things can work together, they should work together, and we really need a new system design that encourages us to put them together in a clever way. The longer that we delay this integrated system, the higher potential losses from these uncoordinated investments. As I said before about renewable energy, all of the costs are built in right up front. So if we carry on with this uncoordinated activity, we're just going to lock in all of these costs right from the start, whether they are sensible or not, whether they work together or not, and we'll just have to live with the consequences. So the longer that this goes on uncoordinated, the bigger potential we've got for increasing these costs, sinking these costs into the system, and undermining Australia's potential to realise this renewable energy superpower status. So these reforms are needed so that Australia can capitalise on the opportunities of this coming renewable energy era. There's 3 opportunities for us, as I said, and they're really huge. Supplying this build-out across the world, being home to energy-intensive industries, production and export of renewable energy commodities. As I said, the investment and build-out is a limited time offer. Australia needs to develop its industry expertise to be ready to capitalise on it and have something to offer the global market. They're not going to come knocking on our door saying, come on Australia, what can you do for us? We've got to be out there saying, look, we've developed these solutions, this is the best solution for you, come and step into my office. The best way to do this is to rapidly decarbonise our own economy. Go to 100%, don't fiddle around with 50% or whatever. Go all the way, because it's only when you challenge yourself to reach these targets that you're going to be forced to find these innovative solutions that no one else has bothered to discover yet. This is something that Australia can do and be ahead of the rest of the world. we've kind of, over the last few years, we've lost our position in the race a little bit, and we really need to do something dynamic to catch back up. Now, energy-intensive industries will relocate in search of abundant and low-cost energy. So, for Australia to attract these industries, obviously we have to reverse the problems and price hikes that have followed the national reforms. Deliberately consolidating Australia's energy use to electricity is a chance to turn this huge error into a great advantage. It's a bold move, but one that will future-proof Australia. This is the redesign of the machine. There's no reason to see global decarbonisation as a threat. This is a huge opportunity for Australia. Renewable energy is Australia's superpower. That's it for me.
Well, thank you very much, Gerard. Fantastic presentation. And now we move to a panel discussion. So, as I read out people's bios, if they could please make their way to the stage. Professor Karen Hussey is Deputy Director at the Global Change Institute at the University of Queensland. She trained as a political scientist and economist, and she undertakes research in the field of public policy and governance, with a particular interest in public policy related to sustainable development. Her recent research is focused on water and energy security, the role of the state in climate change mitigation and adaptation, and the links between international trade and environmental regulation. Professor Ross Garner will be well known to many of you. He is a professoral research fellow in economics at the University of Melbourne. He was a senior economic policy official in Papua New Guinea's Department of Finance in the year Australian independence in 1975. Principal Economic Advisor to Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke and Australian Ambassador to China between 1985 and 1988. He's the author of many influential reports to the government, including various Garner reviews that you'll all be familiar with. Tim Buckley is Director of the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. He has 25 years of financial markets experience, having spent the majority of his time as a top-rated equities research analyst in Australia, with time covering global and Asian equity markets. From 1998 to 2007, he held the position of Managing Director at Citigroup and was Head of Australasian Equity Research in 2001. Tim was also Head of Research for Deutsche Bank, based in Singapore between 1996 and 1998. Tim has published numerous financial papers, including Remote Prospects, a financial analysis of Adani's coal gamble in Australia's Galilee Basin in November 2013, Peak Thermal Coal Demand by 2016 in conjunction with Carbon Tracker initiative in September 2014, and most recently Energy Markets in Transition in January of this year. And we've also like to invite Fergus Green, who you've heard from already this afternoon, this evening, and Gerard, if you could please find your seats.
Did you get the nice one? Okay.
Now I'll hand you this mic. You got the other one. Does that work?
Just there again.
Or else I can swap with this one. Okay. And waters for everyone. Thanks, Rob. So I'm going to ask a few Dorothy Dixes to get the panel discussion going. And I'll start with you, Karen.
Right.
And given we've got the Paris Climate Conference coming up in, as Fergus said, 5 weeks. I thought it was about 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Can you please give us a sense of the relevance of this report, but also the relevance of this in the context of Australia's positioning at the climate conference, and particularly this issue around the advantages of Australia pushing maybe for harder targets more ambitious targets rather than being a lagger?
Yes, indeed. Let me start with two things. The first is congratulations to BZE and Gerard for a fantastic report. This is exactly the kind of research that needs to be done and communicated in the way that it was communicated. And I say that as an academic who's written a number of papers that only my mother and a few colleagues have read. Second to say, apologies if I sound nervous. I'm not in fact nervous, I'm just freezing. I think 6 weeks in Brisbane and my physiology has fundamentally changed. So apologies for that. So what is the relevance of this report for the COP21 negotiations that are going to take place very shortly in Paris? To understand that, we have to understand what the premise of the report is. And to my mind, the premise is twofold. The first is that in order for us to maintain global average temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius, we need to actually articulate and achieve that vision that Gerard has just pointed to or described in such a compelling fashion. We need to transition from a fossil fuel heavy economy to that renewable energy nirvana that we've just understood. That transition is very, very clearly underway. Okay? And I suspect if I ask this question, we'll demonstrate that. Hands up if you have PV panels on your roof. Okay. Hands up if you are dying to be able to go down to Bunnings and just off the shelf buy your batteries to attach to that system. Right, me too. And I'm married to a German engineer, so you would not believe what our house is doing right now. So we know the transition is happening, okay? And I think it's important to understand, I suspect that everything that we say from here on is going to really focus on the economic benefits of this shift. But I just wanted to say at the outset, because I have the privilege of being the first speaker, that ultimately what drove this and what should continue to drive this is a recognition that if we go beyond 2 degrees, we are well and truly screwed. Okay, so we cannot lose sight of that. The second premise in the report is that Australia should no longer be scared of strong climate targets. We have had a love-hate relationship with the UNFCCC negotiations for the best part of 15 years, depending on who's in power, but a tremendous unease around exactly how we should engage with this process, because we've always felt that economically we stood to lose an enormous amount. This report goes a long way to demonstrating that not only should we engage in this matter strongly for moral reasons, but that in fact we have an extraordinary economic reason to engage very, very strongly. So that takes me to COP21, which is essentially about trying to articulate what the post-Kyoto, the post-2015 climate arrangements will look like. And there will be 3 things discussed, and all 3 require Australia, in fact demand that Australia have a strong negotiating position on if we're to realise the vision that Gerard has articulated. First, we're going to negotiate global commitments. Notwithstanding, I think, what Fergus said in relation to broad and shallow, the stronger the global commitment, the stronger the constraint on carbon, the more rapidly we will achieve this transition. And you can't get away from that. The constraint on carbon and innovation will come faster. The second thing that we'll be negotiating in Paris is the technical and financial assistance that will be provided to support that transition. And importantly, the institutional arrangements that will enable that transition. So there's an awful lot of skepticism about these kinds of negotiations. Just a drunkard, well, maybe. I'll let you know. But it's not just the formal negotiations, it's the informal negotiations. Right? It's the corridor conversations with the industry folk that are there. That's where many of these institutional arrangements are negotiated, when where business opportunities are found. The third is in relation to climate adaptation, particularly the financing around climate adaptation. And I'll stop on this because I'm conscious of time. when we think of climate adaptation, we tend to think of sea level rise. How do we change our planning regimes to account for a 0.8 metre rise by 2050? Or how do we make sure that we're more resilient to cyclones, or whatever it might be? There is a very, very strong link between your capacity to be resilient and adaptable to climate impacts and the climate mitigation options that you employ. It's a win-win. So when we think about climate adaptation options, we need to do it in the context of climate mitigation options as well, because there are a lot of benefits. Very quickly, if we think of a remote community that might be subjected to particular impacts, they're going to be a lot more resilient to those impacts if, for example, they don't rely on a massive grid that just came down because a tree fell on it as a consequence of a cyclone. So understanding where distributed energy generation can actually make you more adaptable and resilient to climate impacts is just as important in my mind, because it's highly unlikely that we're going to keep it too far away from 2 degrees. I'll leave it there and look forward to questions.
Thanks, Karen. And Ross, you're next on the line. So the question's to you. You've written a lot about energy superpowers recently. In addition to the comments Gerard makes in the report about the need for national energy market reform to continue, in fact, correct some of the mistakes in the past, what else can Australia do to really position itself to take advantage of these opportunities that are outlined in the report?
Well, first, I think it's a terrific report, and I'd like to underline a couple of points. That rather dramatic map of the world that Gerard put up, it shows the strength of Australia and its renewable energy resources, even when you don't take population into account. Australia's red and Brazil fairly red when you don't take into account that our resources only have to cover 24 million people and Brazil's 150 million. China was already pretty bluish, but it's got to divide what it's got between 1.36 billion people. So if Gerard did the same graph on per capita grounds, which is the basis of international comparative advantage in trade, then you get much more dramatic coloration. We'd probably end up as the only red one amongst the developed countries, at least. I think the report has very powerfully and importantly drawn our attention to a whole lot of opportunities with energy-intensive industries in the future. But there's another set that we could focus on, and that is the energy-intensive industries that are coming into existence in the low-carbon world. Those two big circles, the big circle to do with solar power that Fergus drew, every one of those solar panels has got a big hunk of pure silicon in it, and to make that big circle is millions of tons of pure silicon. Well, silicon's very expensive. You make it out of sand or quartz and lots of energy. Again, Australia's got a fair bit of that. The batteries that, again, become much more important, use a lot of specialised material, a lot of graphite. You need graphite resources plus a lot of energy to purify. Well, again, we have those resources. The rare earths that are very important inputs in the battery, all of them require a lot of energy as well as the raw materials. We've got those. In the low-carbon world, both India and China at least will have a very large nuclear component of their zero emissions industry. The enrichment of uranium requires the uranium oxide in the ground and a lot of energy. There's 7 or 8 major energy-intensive industries which will become much more important in international production and trade in the low-carbon world, and Australia will have a very strong advantage in all of those. So what can we do to prepare ourselves for the world that Gerard start where he started, reform of the grid. We really have created a heavy load for our back. The right answer to the question out of the book was $75 billion, but I was discussing the question of what to do with the superfluous investment that's been made in the grid the last 8 years. Just last week with the chair of the Australian energy regulator, and she said, well, that is the $85 billion question. Certainly part of the answer can be greater use of electricity through the grid, and electric cars, more electric appliances, more efficient house cooling and heating through electric-based pump systems rather than gas systems. That would all help. But I think to be able to rely on our currently horrifically expensive grid to deliver electricity in a way that gives us all the change that we want is probably going to require bigger change than that. It's going to require movement to a more efficient pricing basis for the grid, and that would run in the opposite direction of current tendencies to want to charge everyone a fixed charge for being linked to the grid. All of the economics says that's what you don't do. The microeconomics, first of all, says you don't rely on rate of return regulation. That was all worked out by Eversham Johnson in the 60s. Well, who made that mistake? The next thing you don't do is recover the cost of the grid through fixed charges. And Arrow at Harvard proved that in the 70s. I hope we don't make the second basic mistake as well as the first one. Putting on charges for use of capacity is a very different thing. That allows each household to reduce its cost of access to the system if it reduces its capacity. And it can do that by demand management, lowering its energy use by use of batteries at peak times. That would move us in the direction of an efficient electricity network system. If we went in that direction, if we gave everyone the choice of just choosing to pay for that amount of capacity they actually use, then we'd have huge redundancy in the grid. And Arrow tells us that really you make a mess of everything if you try to recover that in charges from consumers. That will have to be written off if we're going to have an efficient system. Who carries that cost? Well, the Grattan Institute report about a year ago said there's a few choices. Lump sums lumped on consumers. I can't actually see how that can work without distorting the use of electricity. Governments in one way or another, or the electricity corporations that made the investments themselves. They will argue that they were only responding in this huge overinvestment to incentives put there by government, and they were right. They would be right in saying that. Maybe a carbon tax to pay for the write-down. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Ross. Tim, you and your organisation have done some amazing work on stranded assets, and you've also been following what's been happening in China and India and other countries around the world in terms of countries transitioning away from coal towards renewables. I was wondering whether you could make some comments about the relevance of this report, given those trends, but also some of the issues Gerard's been raising also about technology lock-in and leading to more stranded assets unless we make the right decisions now to position Australia for the economy of the future.
I think Gerard's point about it's a limited time offer is a very key point, because if Australia doesn't grab the opportunity that is very ably illustrated in this report, other countries are going to grab it and run with that. And I suppose I'm going to answer the question that I would like to have asked, which is... I'll admit that one. I was listening... Yeah.
Multiple choice.
In Fergus's introduction, he talked about there are three key factors that are really evident today. I think we will look back on 2015 and realise there's a fourth factor. I'm an optimist, I'll admit that. But to me, the fourth factor that's not on Fergus's list, it's not on anyone's real list at the moment, but it's very firmly something I'm studying every day, and that is India. And where I'm going with that is that Fergus's third point was China. China is transforming before our eyes. It's actually something we've been working on for a decade. It's just funny we've cottoned onto that now. India is replicating, or is looking to replicate what China has been doing. They're going to do it at a lower cost because the technology costs have come down. They're going to do it at a big and faster scale because China's shown you can do it very fast at scale. So I'm hoping we'll look back in 2 years' time and realise the fourth point that Fergus should have put down is India. And I'm reminded, it's my pet subject at the moment, because I think it will transform the world. Think about why is India so important? It's the second largest population in the world. It's the third largest electricity market in the world. And they are yet to build their grid. So they're sitting there, and Prime Minister Modi was elected 18 months ago, and he was elected with an absolute basket case in many respects. And we had double-digit inflation, double-digit interest rates, a current account deficit, a collapsing currency, a banking system chock full of bad debts to the fossil fuel industry, and he gave his Energy Minister Goyal, a mandate to try and fix that problem. Just a small problem. Goyal studied it, and he came up with one number. And the number he articulated at the start of 2015 was 175 gigawatts. And 175 gigawatts are renewable by 2022 from virtually a standing start. And so to get back to Gerard's point, there is a limited time offer. India is going to move very, very rapidly to replicate what China's done, and we're going to look back on 2015 and realise all the superpowers are moving. It's about time Australia got the picture.
Thanks, Tim. So, do you want to ask your own question? No, I mean, maybe if you can just add to that point about India and the other work that you might have been doing in addition to China and the trends you see internationally.
Yeah, sure.
Or ask your own question.
No, I'll answer that one. I feel compelled first to actually answer Karen's question. You'll have seen that I didn't put my hand up when we asked who has solar panels on their homes. And I should explain the reason for that is that I rent part of a flat in a 16-storey building in central London, and none of those factors are particularly conducive to renewable energy. So that's my excuse. But that actually sort of nicely illustrates the point. So London, you would have seen on Gerard's map, is not particularly well endowed with renewable energy resources. It's actually not too bad. It's actually better than we often think it is, particularly the south of England. There's not bad solar resources. But it's interesting that the UK has a roughly bipartisan aim to decarbonise its electricity sector by 2030. It's not widely known. Their electricity, I forget the multiple, but I think it's about 4 times as large as ours, their electricity sector, roughly. I might be slightly out there, but it's bigger than ours in absolute terms. And their bipartisan aim is to decarbonise it by 2030. Now, the way they're going about it is in fits and starts. I certainly won't endorse the UK as a model of electricity decarbonisation planning. But they've done, they've got some good aims and roughly bipartisan commitment. How you get there is patchy, but it's really interesting that in a country which has pretty terrible renewable energy resources on the whole, it's quite challenging to decarbonise the UK. They're looking at a mix of nuclear, offshore wind, which is still quite expensive. It will come down over time with deployment by the UK, China and others, but at the moment it's relatively expensive. a bit of gas, a real mix of options. And they're still aiming to decarbonise by 2030. And we're still talking about, whether we should, should we lower our renewable energy target? We've settled that one now. We're going to have a real 20% by 2020, and then, a sort of doubling that is seen as bold, or a 50% target is seen as really bold. So, I mean, the UK, I think, really shows us up when you consider how much easier technically and economically it would be for us to decarbonise our electricity sector for all the reasons that Gerard's talked about. To give another couple of comparisons, so Denmark currently gets 40% of its energy from renewable sources, and its plan is to have 100% renewable energy by 2035. On a particularly windy day this July, Denmark produced more than 100% of its electricity from renewables, and it exported the surplus to other countries. Germany, the world's fourth largest economy, already gets a quarter of its energy from renewables. It's got an aim, I think, of 60% by 2035. Again, much worse renewable resources than Australia. California, which does have good resources, is I think debating a 50% target by 2030. So the leading edge of the pack. I mean, we're still nowhere near there in sort of countries of comparable size, mostly with worse renewable resources. We could completely eclipse that. So just the one final point, which is sort of around in the kind of transitional phase, though, I think it's actually the countries which are going to be doing the really big build-outs of renewables in absolute terms. It is the Chinas and the Indias, where we can now start to be relatively confident that at least some really big countries are moving. Because the one thing that you didn't say was your chart about the $53 trillion opportunity, which was the International Energy Agency, was of course the 450 ppm scenario, which is that if the world moves to 2 degrees. And the unfortunate reality is that we're not yet on track to 2 degrees, and it is quite possible, sadly, that we won't actually move down that path. And of course, if you're investing, then you're looking to what's likely to happen, not necessarily what ought to happen. But I think that this is where what China's doing and what India's doing, when a few really big countries start to move, not only do they create huge markets themselves, which we should be looking as to where we can specialise to tap into that, but also it means other countries are more likely to move. So you're in this kind of dynamic waiting game, and big countries move, then more other countries are likely to move quickly. So we're likely to see these kind of tipping dynamics. So I actually think we're much more likely to kind of get on that path, which means the opportunities for us will be really big.
Thanks, Gerard. Gerard, did you want to respond to any of those comments, but also to tell everyone what this photo is on the screen, which also happens to be the front photo of the report.
Yeah, it's not supposed to symbolise the Iron Curtain of the Cold War era. But actually what it is a furnace for producing high-grade silicon, which you can turn into solar panels, which is produced in Western Australia by a company called Simcoa. So they convert quartz into high-grade silicon, which goes into solar panels or even into aluminium or other electronics, and they do it with an electric arc furnace. It's an energy-intensive industry. It's everything in one. That's why it's on the cover. Other points, I suppose, to pick up. I really agree with Tim on India. I mean, what we see with China at the moment is.
Can you hold up the mic?
Very good. Is that all right?
Yeah.
What we see with China now is we've seen the change take place in China. We've seen them go from this mentality of the build out of coal and this 20th century heavy industry, and they've changed, and we've seen it. We haven't seen all the implications of that yet, but we've seen the decision making change and the objectives change. And we haven't quite seen that with India yet, and it's really great that India waited until now for that moment. moment to develop, because they will do a lot of their development with renewable energy because it makes sense for them economically and strategically, so they will do that. That's a bonus. And the one other thing that I just wanted to point out, I didn't really go through it in my slide, but Ferg brought it up, different scenarios about how investment might turn out over the next period ahead. And I did show the 450 scenario because I actually think that's more likely. And if you look at the evolution of the energy sector in the last few years, what you see, so the IEA has a couple of different scenarios on what they think might evolve in the energy sector, and one of them is, they call it new policy scenario, which doesn't really mean anything to anybody, but what it is projecting the world's energy use, assuming that there's no change in energy policy over the next 20 years. So anyone that lives in Australia knows that energy policy changes all the time. And that fixed trajectory is not a fixed line into the future. It's evolving, and what we've seen is that business as usual new policy line evolving towards the 450 scenario, not the other way around. It's coming down and converging with the 450 scenario. So I think that is the more likely thing to be paying attention to. Now, usually policymakers just pay attention to the new policy scenario because it seems to be relevant across political timelines of 2 or 3 years. But planning energy, you need to be thinking longer term than that. You need to start looking at the scenario that we're actually converging upon to make smart decisions. And incidentally, the new policy scenario is still about 40% of the renewable energy power systems and energy efficiencies. That's where the investment's going. And coal goes from 1% to 2%.
Okay, now I've done a terrible job at timekeeping because I know some of the panelists have to leave in about 10 minutes. 10 minutes? 15? Is that all right? 15? So we're going to have some questions from the audience, and we've got one mic. So what I'll get you to do, please, Laura's kindly holding the mic. If you could please, if you have a question, line up in the aisle behind Laura. We have, rather than kind of running a microphone around the whole audience, please come forward if you want to ask a question. And if you do have other commitments that need to run, thank you very much for coming tonight. Don't forget to buy a book on the way out. So first question, and this isn't an opportunity for you to raise any concerns about anything that's not related to the report. If you could please address your question to the topic at hand and to the report specifically, and also to comment some of the panelists might have made already. Is that working? It's working.
Okay. Something that wasn't touched on too much in the presentation, but maybe will be touched on in the report, is something I think could be very important for going beyond zero emissions. That's how we manage our land. So, for example, with a cheap method of carbon sequestration and a potential income source in a future carbon trading market. And from what I understand, there's still a lot of uncertainty and discussion about land use in the lead up to Paris. So what role do you see land use having in terms of Australia's carbon future and going beyond net zero emissions?
I might start with an answer and then ask the panellists. Beyond Zero Emissions has produced a land use discussion paper in collaboration with Melbourne University. It highlights each of the sources of emissions in agriculture and forestry, and clearly outlines a range of solutions that can be adopted. There are some renewable energy opportunities, bioenergy opportunities, which relate to the topic at hand. So I might ask Gerard to touch briefly on those in terms of bioenergy and biofuels.
Excuse me. Yeah, I won't dwell too much time on this one because we've got a whole another book on that subject. I think that there's probably one of those reports out on the table. Maybe we'll go through that because it's a big subject, and this is a whole different subject. Biofuels, I think, certainly part of the picture.
maybe afterwards about the specifics of that report, that separate report. Thank you. Next question, please.
This is a question to anybody who would like to answer. Distributed generation like rooftop solar suits cities' domestic arrangements very well. The industry that is energy intensive needs a more energy generation focus. What would that be like? What's going to make the energy generation grow to run things like aluminium plants or steel plants? What's going to provide that focus of energy?
Ross, are you happy to have a start at that one?
Really, Gerard and the report have laid the basis for answering that in talking about the opportunities for large-scale, low-cost production of renewable energy. Now, both the renewables that were the focus of this report, solar and wind, are intermittent. The two together are a good combination. You need some form of storage alongside of that, and alongside demand management to balance up the equation. But there are lower and lower cost forms of storage. The cheapest at the moment is pumped hydro storage. There are 30 gigawatts of pumped hydro storage being installed in the current 5-year plan in China, where you take the surplus wind at 2 o'clock in the morning, or the surplus sun at 12 o'clock, use it to pump water up a hill and run it down through the generator, which is the pump in reverse when you need it. And the cost of that can be low if you've got the right sites, and we've got some excellent sites in Australia. But battery storage before too long may very well be competitive. I was talking to the chief executive of the leading group, Greensmith, putting in grid level storage in the United States just yesterday, and he said that in the last 2 years there's been a 50% reduction in the cost of lithium-ion batteries on a large scale. So you don't have to continue that rate of reduction for very long for large-scale batteries to be competitive with pumped hydro storage. So you don't need all that much storage if you've got a combination of different renewable energies, and in some Australian locations you've got exactly that. Complement that with efficient storage, and you've got large-scale energy available much more cheaply for industry in Australia than in any other developed country.
Karen.
Can I just add very quickly to that? Both California and Germany have very ambitious storage targets. Now, it's not economic for them to do that, but we should be very, very grateful that they are doing that. For the same reason that we should be grateful that Germany picked the technology. It is not technology agnostic in the way that we are. Because by pumping the money into those technologies, this storage, ultimately that drags the cost function down, which means that we can address that very problem that you're talking about in Australia. So I'd say there's a 5 to 7 year time lag there, but that problem won't be the problem very, very soon.
So just as a comment, I just really struggle to imagine a plant like Alcoa running on batteries. It just takes so much energy, and the vastness of the storage needs to be so big that I think there needs to be work into something more like energy farms, and not just sort of this distributed sort of generation arrangements that we sort of focus on now.
So a quick response, and then we'll move to the next question. As Ross said, there are a range of technologies, including concentrated solar thermal, pumped storage hydro, that will be able to supply or can supply energy-intensive industry. Our next, beyond zero emissions, next foray will be into industrial processes. So how we can make aluminium, steel, cement, using high temperature solar thermal, medium temperature solar thermal, a range of other technologies. So that's our next mega plan.
I look forward to that.
Please come back in another 12 months or so. Next question.
Look, my question relates to short to medium term energy and fuel security. Refining capacity has been moved offshore, or a lot of it's been moved offshore, so we're importing a lot of our fuel and gas. A lot of our day-to-day living is dependent on logistics. Coals bring all their milk in from the country, processed in the city, and then ship it out. I mean, if we asked our government, would they be able to give us a risk mitigation plan for covering those kind of eventualities if we was to cut off our fuel supply?
Ross, you have a go at that one?
Fortunately, for the reasons that Gerard set out, we're going to be much less dependent on refined petroleum in a few years' time.
Gerard, anything to add?
Just briefly. Yeah, I mean it's a risk. It's a risk that we've carried for a while, but I mean we are riding a bit closer to the wind now than we ever have. I mean our imports have really surged. It's in the report. I didn't really cover it here, but our imports have surged because our reserves have depleted. At the same time, we've run down our storage capacity. So yes, it's an issue. But yes, so long as there's no disruptions to global oil supply, we're all right. That never happens, does it?
Tim, yes.
I think that the whole point of Gerard's report is to highlight that where there is risk, there are also opportunities. And to me, the report really highlights the fact Australia is blessed with huge amounts of land with a low population. We're blessed with huge wind and solar resources, and given my finance background, I'd also remind everyone we've got the 4th largest superannuation pool in the world, and we've got a very, very strong financial market system, and we've actually got really good technology, universities, engineers. So put all that together, Australia is a perfect place, as Gerard sort of concluded, for renewable energy and for industries that are energy intensive, because we've got great finance, great land, great solar and wind resources.
Stable government.
We just changed funds as well. Okay, thanks, Tim. Next question.
There was a fascinating idea that came out of Charlestown University in collaboration with Indonesian and Chinese universities a few years ago that explored the idea of connecting Australia to Indonesia and Asia with HVDC cables to directly supply clean energy straight from Western Australia into where it's needed, where it's difficult for these countries to produce any clean energy at all. Wondering if that's been explored or if we have a response to it.
Yes, and Andrew Blakers and others from ANU have also looked at this, and we did look at it. So, Gerard.
Yeah, page 37.
We were expecting that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't have time to go through everything, but yeah, that has been looked at as a possibility. I mean, there are a lot of barriers involved in that sort of an arrangement, not only technical ones. It's most definitely technically possible. There's also some other things around the political sensitivity of that sort of thing, and that Southeast Asian region is actually building an interconnected grid right now in amongst themselves. They haven't invited Australia into it just yet. But that has been looked at, because one of the things is that Indonesia is actually the fastest growing electricity demand in the world. You know, China's big, but Indonesia is coming up from a lower base, and they electrify things fairly rapidly. And even with all of the above type of strategy which they're pursuing at the moment, they're struggling to keep up. And this is something that Australia can lend a hand with, and one of the things I point out before is that we could export power to Indonesia at a lower cost than their current pool energy prices. So by doing that, that will bring down power costs in Indonesia. And just as a bit of an indicator, I pointed out in page 36 that even supplying only 10% of the of the electricity that's forecast for Indonesia in 2050 would be $12 billion a year worth of electricity to transmit over there. I mean, that's 10%. That's a big opportunity if you can make it a reality.
I think Karen had some additional comments to make. And just before Karen jumps in, there's also, so the ASEAN countries are building a grid which will connect those countries. ZERC is a project where there's potential to connect North Africa with Europe, and also there's talk about a grid between Iceland and the UK to tap into Iceland's geothermal energy. But Karen, what comments were you going to add to that?
Yeah, I was part of the original, or one of the original AMU studies looking at the potential for us to export to Indonesia and up through Southeast Asia to China. Now, just next week, kicking off a project looking at the feasibility and desirability of greater energy and electricity integration between Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. Now, having said that, there are things to acknowledge. The Indonesians were very quick to say to the Australian team, what makes you think we want more energy? And I say that in only partial jest, right? I mean, they have an extremely ambitious energy plan. They have problems which will not be fixed by a grid because they have so many thousands of islands. So they're now looking at distributed energy generation that allows each island to be resilient through microgrids, for example. So there might be a single connection between the two largest islands. I fell in love with the ZERC idea. God, give me a map and I'll put lines on it. This is great, it rocks. And then you have something like Ukraine fall apart, and you understand very quickly why it is that Germany didn't take a stronger stance against Russia. Right? So there are pros and cons because of the gas supplies from Russia. So the geopolitics, never mind the technicalities, never mind even the economics, it's $500 billion for us to do a HVDC up into Indonesia and beyond. $500 billion. Even if you had that in your back pocket, you have the geopolitical realities. And the study that we're doing, which is funded by the Japanese. Okay? You guys say more. Okay? So it's a very tricky area. Not handy that.
No. I'm just going to check the phone for time. How are we going, Tim? One more? Two more? Yep. Okay, two more questions. Next one, please.
Another question. There are 100+ superphones in this room. If you Google Malcolm Turnbull email, you get a direct link to his parliamentary office. If everyone sent an email tonight with Renewable Energy Superpower in the subject line, he could not but ask his staff to get him briefed on his own report, I would think. And there are probably some people who've got more direct links, politicians that have not a bad idea.
Great suggestion. We have a hashtag going tonight with Twitter, hashtag Energy Superpower, so that's one way to do it as well. But yes, an email directly would be up to you as an audience, but I would certainly encourage it.
And taking up Stephen's point at the beginning, that Malcolm Turnbull back in 2010 said it's a simple matter of arithmetic that if we're to reach 2 degrees, all developed countries will have to decarbonise their electricity systems by the middle of the century. Malcolm was onto that a bit earlier than others. The G7 heads of government in Germany in the middle of this year came to his 2010 conclusion 5 years later.
Yes. And we have a video, that's all on video on YouTube if you want to actually look at the Malcolm Turnbull's comments on our station energy plan, which was launched 5 years ago. And we are going to be reminding the Prime Minister of this very shortly. Yes,
If the mountain won't come to Mohammed must come to the mountain. Now, we have a problem here that a lot of people in this room, and pretty much all the panel, can see that there's a very large distance between where the capital is that's required for all of these things and where the investment's coming to where it's got to be. Now, of course, if Mohammed had been on the mountain, it would have been a lot simpler. So my question is, since everybody agrees that the money's got to go from here to there, and I imagine if you guys were in charge of all that money, the problem would already be solved. The question is, how do we get those resources to be applied to the problem?
Good question. You're the money man, Tim. Do you want to start? And then Karen, you're actually, let's start with Karen. She's shaking in her seat with excitement.
Very quickly, I think the number was $28 trillion. Where has he gone? $28 trillion to be spent, Gerard said, in the coming years on renewable energy infrastructure and technologies. So at least a portion of that, the rules around where it will be spent, how it will be spent, who's allowed to spend it and access it, will be generated through UNFCCC, particularly for developing.
Sorry, I wildly disagree with John.
Wildly disagree.
Go ahead. To me, that's one of the reasons why we really need to be a leader in the UNFCCC process, because a lot of those underlying institutions are set there, and that's where some of the funding goes.
I think for or add, contribute.
Tim should definitely answer this question, but I mean, I just don't see that the UNFCCC framework being the main source of final finance. And I think
the main source is a source.
Yeah, I think a really small one actually. I think that the UNFCCC and the Green Climate Fund are sort of at the margins really actually. It's mostly going to be about national frameworks, policy frameworks, channel private investment.
Yeah. I'll agree with Fergus. To me, the answer is finance hates uncertainty. And what's Australia had in the last 2 years? Massive energy policy uncertainty. And as Bloomberg's illustrated perfectly, renewable energy investment in Australia has just collapsed in the last 2 years. That's what uncertainty did. We now have a government that's focused on looking forward. We've got policy certainty. It's going to progressively get better. That would be my forecast. And so finance loves certainty, and if it's commercially viable, which renewables is, energy efficiency is, batteries will certainly be within 1 to 2 years, the money will pour in. I'm an optimist, but finance is virtually unlimited. If you can get a good project with a good rate of return, finance will fund it, and we now have policy certainty, which is the prerequisite.
Ross, one last comment and we'll wrap up.
Capital's never been cheaper in the history of the world than it is at the moment. Approximately zero real interest rates in developed countries. There's not going to be any problem funding any required level of investment if the incentive structures are right. And we can see that we provided incentives for network investment that wasn't needed at all. We got 85 billion of it.
Okay, we only have to leave it there. Tim's got to catch a plane. Can I please ask you all to thank the panelists?